I'm still in conversation with Dr. Mbete. Doc, of course, there's one plenary that's currently in session where world leaders are talking about very high level, but a resilient world, the G20's contribution. I want to talk about some of the key issues relative to African problems. When you look at issues like disaster risk reduction, climate change, just energy transition, as well as food systems and even food security, what does that mean relative to the African debt question? I mean, a lot of the times we've been hearing that African countries are battling to service their high debt. And oftentimes what they are doing is they are depleted from a health and education perspective and are not even investing in those key areas. Practically, what are we talking about when we say that these key priorities are things that are needed to be focused on, but then there is this debt question hovering over Africa?
And we know that the debt question was a huge part of South Africa's agenda for this year, and this question of debt sustainability, because we know that many developing nations are heavily indebted, but heavily indebted in a way that is unsustainable. And the unsustainableness of the debt isn't from the amount of debt necessarily that they have, but actually from the debt repayments, because of the cost of that debt, the very high interest rates that states have to pay that are from the developing world, from the global south, particularly African states, whose borrowing costs are so much higher than those of developed nations, even when those African states' debt to GDP ratio, so the actual amount of debt that you have relative to the productiveness of your economy, is actually so much better in a lot of African states than in the developed world, where they have very high debt to GDP ratios and yet can borrow from the market at a much lower rate than African nations can. And so this was a big issue and this continues to be a big issue for South Africa, and a number of things that have come out and commitments that have come out of this year of discussions in the G20 about how to manage both relations between creditors and the debtor nations, and South Africa setting up a borrowers club, so to speak, to be able to see if better terms for debt can't be achieved collectively rather than on a one-on-one basis, but then also wanting to engage with the creditor nations, so both the creditor sovereigns as well as development banks, both the regional development banks and the international ones, as well as private creditors, because we also know that actually a great deal of the debt that nations are getting comes from private banks and other private sources. And so that is a big fundamental structural issue that needs to be dealt with. But also then, how do you, in that context, finance the things that you have to finance?
Yeah, I mean, we've been hearing, and I don't want you to lose your thoughts, but maybe just incorporate this. We've been hearing a lot about the role of multilateral banks when we talk about consensual financing, particularly from those countries that have this debt burden.
Yes, and so, how do you ensure that you can have cheaper loans? Because ultimately countries need to take loans in order to be able to do the kind of investment that is required into healthcare, into education, into developing the human capacity that is required to grow their economies. So how do you do those on a much better set of terms, both in terms of the repayment terms, so how long it's going to take for you to repay the debt, but then also the interest rates that you have to pay. And then the second thing is, how do you make sure, we were talking earlier about the co-chaired committee that South Africa and Germany were co-chairing, and South Africa has received a bunch of finance from Germany, or commitment to finance rather, as part of the just energy transition. But one of the big questions about that has been how much of this is grants, so actually gifts, money that is given in order to help South Africa's development, and how much is it loans? And that balance between grants and loans, I think, is a really critical one, because what you don't want is countries to be taking an unnecessary debt burden when it could be, which is going to further burden them in terms of their own development, because what we're trying to get away from is a situation where we're spending more money on interest payments every year than we can spend on health and education. And then just lastly, on food security, South Africa established in this G20 a working group on food security, which is really critical, because one of the lessons of the Ukraine war is that, so much of the African continent is reliant on its food stability from elsewhere. And South Africa is a rarity on the African continent in that we produce enough food for ourselves. And our food insecurity is a distribution problem, actually, more than it is a production problem. That we produce enough food for ourselves and for export. Our big problem is that not everyone can afford the food that we produce internally, and we need to address that. It's a big inequality problem. But in many countries on the continent, they don't produce enough food to feed themselves and rely on export markets, on importing wheat, on importing other important grains, and this needs to be dealt with in a two-pronged way. The first is making it cheaper for African states to be able to access the food that they need on global markets, but secondly, to help to develop domestic food systems in countries on the African continent so that we can be self-sustaining and self-feeding, given that the majority of arable agricultural land in the world remains on the African continent.
Dr. Mbete, a lot of South Africans, I would imagine even some citizens from other countries in the African continent, have that so what question at the back of their minds. It is a historic moment for South Africa, for the African continent, but what does this mean practically for me, who is unemployed as a South African or somebody sitting in any of our African continents? Practically, how does the African how do the African leaders seize the moment in as far as looking at this being the last of the Global South presidencies, and the risk and the question of, will the United States really, take the baton and really continue with this, or is this a missed opportunity? So what do? We focus on African countries. What are the practicalities in terms of those that are sitting at home and really don't understand to what extent it will go? Is it a question of these are long-term development goals and not necessarily having a short-termism kind of approach?
Well, look, the first thing that I've been saying to everybody about what's the point of having this thing, is that the reality in international politics and in diplomacy is that if you aren't at the table, if you haven't been invited to the table, you best believe you are on the menu. And so, that we not only are at the table, but that we're hosting the lunch party, I think is a good thing, and has enabled us to shape some of the discussion in ways that we otherwise would not be able to. And South Africa has done that throughout its participation and its membership of the G20. Remember that South Africa is an original member of the G20. We were included in the G20 from 1998 with the first finance ministers meetings, and then, of course, with the leaders meeting. So I think that's a really critical thing to say, is that in all the time of South Africa's participation in the G20, there's a lot that we have gained out of it, and it's a good thing that we don't know what it is, because there's a lot around our position in the global economy, that we continue to be seen as a systemically significant economy, that is a result of our participation within platforms like the G20. But to answer your question directly, there are many of the issues on the agenda of the G20 that build up over time. Climate finance is a classic one. When it was first introduced in 2011, 2012 to the G20 agenda, no one thought it belonged there. Now you can't imagine a G20 that isn't discussing issues of how you finance the energy transition and mitigation for climate change. And so many of the issues of the G20 are develop and take on meaning gradually over time. However, in this moment, Africa has a really powerful opportunity to build on the momentum of these discussions that have been happening. And the first thing that I would do if I was if the leader of an African state would be to get my regional partners together to say, how do we start actioning the African Continental Free Trade Agreement today, not tomorrow? Yesterday, and how do we start then holding the fire to the feet of those G7 nations and also other partners in the G20 who've made all these commitments to partnership with us? How do we start actioning those in real time as soon as this ministers' meeting or this leaders' summit is concluded? And then a final thing is, how do we get this information out to our citizens for them to understand why a summit such as this happens, what it actually means for them, and then what it is that we need to do as citizens to hold our leaders to account for the commitments that they've made in this platform?
You know, a lot of attention has also been on Cyril Ramaposa himself and how he's been able to align himself with very powerful nations and leaders. How critical and significant do you think some of his recent official visits to the various countries in the lead up to the summit were, given the fact that there was a lot of lobbying that we've been seeing, notwithstanding, of course, the work that the Sherpas have been doing with the other nations within the working groups? But how significant a moment is this for President Cyril Ramaphosa, given too that domestically he also has challenges?
It has been really, really critical. And I think that there's a context around domestic politics globally that we don't think about often with these kinds of summits, right? So I was watching Prime Minister of the UK, Keir Starmer, as he came off the plane yesterday, and there was a sense of kind of relief yes. in his whole demeanor because he's facing such challenges at home. Same thing could be said around the Chancellor of Germany, right? Or the Prime Minister of Italy. And so all of these member states actually are facing quite difficult situations in their own countries. And so coming into this kind of summit with their peers, so to speak, is a bit of a holiday for them, just from the daily challenges that they face in their own countries. But having said that, I think that President Ramaphosa has really showed his skill as a negotiator, has really showed his skill as a person who's able to bring together disparate groups. And I mean, we saw it with the GNU negotiations last year, right, around establishing our own government after our last election. But he's incredibly gifted, I think, in being able to put together people in ways that also don't make them feel like they're being manipulated or that they're being coerced. So we did see him on a charm offensive and a tour before this summit, and I think that was certainly to grease kind of the wheels and to ensure that people would be coming into this meeting with the collaborative, cooperative mindset. And to be honest, I keep saying to people now that we're better off, actually, and I think President Ramaphosa is better off for President Trump not having come, or Vice President Vance having come, because had the Americans been here and participating at a high level, this entire G20 would have been about the US. And that's exactly what happened in 2017 at the G20.
Absolutely, and our conversation has never been centered around the United States of America, which is a good thing, because we are trying to find ways in which to see how the African leaders that are present are going to be taking the baton and leading the charge. But importantly, because you've raised the United States of America, what is the question then in terms of how Cyril Ramaphosa's position is going to be viewed at the United States, how the AU will be viewed, how the African continent will be reviewed going forward, because South Africa will still form the troika of the next G20 presidency of the United States. So it will be South Africa, the United States of America, and then the UK. But I mean, we've heard from the UK president being very complimentary on how South Africa has positioned the G20 presidency, and also some of the key issues, saying that they are supportive of the priorities of the African continent. But that still leaves the question and still begs the question, will South Africa, will the African countries be sidelined?
And look, and I think that this is where there is this deep complexity and uncertainty about how the US is going to approach its G20 presidency. Now, the reality is this: the G20 membership exists and it's fixed, right? No presidency has the right to kick out a member of the G20. Certainly, the US may try to do that by revoking visas or whatever it is, making it incredibly difficult for South Africa to participate in the G20 meetings that are going to take place in the United States. We don't yet have any indication that is what is actually going to happen. I do think it was instructive that in the Business 20, which took place last week, the entire US business contingent was here. Everybody who was in business in the US who said that they were going to come to the B20 came to the B20 and made deals and participated fully in the process.
I think we had over 1,000 delegates at the B20.
Yes, and we're hugely complimentary. So to speak, to use South African Twitter terminology, the owners of the US economy were here. No matter what their government had decided to do. And so the work of the G20 is going to continue next year in the United States. Of course, the big question is what the parameters are going to be. We already know that the US wants to have a much more streamlined agenda that focuses much more specifically on the finance issues, which are the traditional, concern of the G20. But amongst those finance issues include the very important issues we've been speaking about that have to do with African states,
which is
around
why
debt, and around the cost of capital. And don't forget that the finance ministers meeting, so the finance track of the G20, that meeting happened in October, in mid-October. The US participated in that meeting at a very high level and endorsed the declaration of finance ministers that came out of the finance ministers meeting in October. So on the issues that are important to the United States around finance and the economy in that way, the US has endorsed the declaration on those issues that came out of South Africa's G20. So the big will it go back on the commitments that it made on the finance track? And some of those issues are included, many of those issues are included in this leaders' declaration that will be adopted tomorrow. And so...
It has been adopted.
It hasn't. It'll be adopted formally, officially tomorrow, right? The other thing that I've been saying to people is that this question around, the US isn't here for a handover or whatever. The handover ceremony is symbolic, as so many things in diplomacy are. It's the photo op, it's the picture. But the work of the G20 has been handed over to the US already. The finance minister, the South African finance minister and the South African finance chairper, who's the Director General of Treasury, handed over their work to the United States at that meeting for the US to then start on their work for their G20 presidency. We have some idea of which of the working groups the US wants to focus on and which ones it doesn't. An important part of the G20's process is that the co-chairs of working groups remain the same year after year. You don't have a change in those working group chairs, which means the co-chairs, which means that there's continuity in the work, regardless of who the presidency is held by, regardless of who the president is.
And I think that's comforting to hear. I want to ask your thoughts around Argentina. I mean, we heard earlier on that Argentina made it very clear that there were a number of issues that they did not endorse. What is the position of Argentina? Of course, we know that it is an ally of the United States.
Yes, well, President Milei of Argentina is a huge buddy and ally of President Trump's. Also, Argentina just got a huge loan, huge cash injection from the United States, which in some part helped President Milei's the election that just took place in Argentina. And so there is a loyalty. They are Team USA, certainly. And I think that that's where the President Ramaposa's terminology earlier, when the sound wasn't switched off when it should have been switched off, and where he referred to decisions being made by consensus or near consensus. I think is instructive.
Yeah.
Because I think that what we're likely to see is that the leaders' declaration, there'll be a statement that it's been adopted by consensus, and then there'll be wording included in the declaration that says all members except Argentina, or some language that shows within the declaration where there is some dissent from Argentina on particular issues in the declaration. And then, of course, because the US isn't participating, they didn't participate in the drafting of the declaration, and they haven't participated by being here at a senior level, then is excluded. So we'll have a G20, we'll probably have a G19 plus one, a G19 members plus Argentina, and then with the 21st, the United States excluded. And look, that's a much better outcome than many people were expecting, given the kind of ructions that we've seen in the last 2-3 weeks.
Dr. Mbete, always a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.